So welcome everyone, welcome to this video that we're recording to help people to know what does it actually take to pass the CBAP exam. And we are having this in the format of an interview with Paul Benn. Paul recently achieved his CBAP exam, or his CBAP status I should say, and he's been a part of our Facebook study group as well. So I'm very much grateful to Paul's time. He's being a great contributor, and he's also spending a bit of time to help us answer those burning questions that we just don't seem to find answers for outside of this kind of forum. So I'm very excited to kick this off. But first of all, I would like to introduce you to Paul. So Paul, did you want to maybe just give us a little bit about who you are and what you're up to? That would be wonderful.
Okay, so as Esther says, I'm Paul, and thanks Esther for inviting me to this. And yeah, so I originated in South Africa, been a BA for about 25 years, moved to New Zealand, Wellington about 2 years ago, and I'm a consultant at Red Vespa, currently on a client site. As my profile says, I've got my Agile certification, and I've just completed my CBAP, which was probably 8 months of solid work, but about 2 or 3 years of on and off because I was immigrating in between when I first started and I put it on hold. I first met Esther when I started on this journey and did some of her courses to get my peak points and also just to get going into the BABOK. So that's me in a nutshell.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Paul. Okay, guys, so let's now jump into the questions. We've got primarily 8 questions, but we may end up deviating as we go. So the first question, and this is a question that I know you've received a lot, and I've certainly received a lot from CBAP and CCBA aspirants through the years. And that is, how do you actually know you are ready and have done enough prep before you go and apply to do the exam? What's your experience of that, Paul?
So I think, for everyone it's going to be slightly different, but a couple of main things that I think are really pertinent here is, first of all, if you're doing simulation exams, and I really strongly suggest you do the simulation exam because they really get your thought process and your thinking aligned to the way the questions can be asked. And a company like Watermark that does simulation exams, they recommend 80%. Once you're hitting the simulation percentage of 80%, you can do it. For me, personally, I'd set myself a target of 90%. That was something I personally said, that's when I would feel comfortable. Yeah. The other thing that I used as well when doing the simulation exams was when I was able to answer a question, but know and explain why I answered that question in the way I answered it. Not just answer because, hey, I remember last time I did a simulation exam, I had the same question and that was the answer. No. Try and be honest and real with yourself on that. And so that means you stopping guessing on answers and getting a lucky guess or just because you remember from last time. And I think the last point here is just really, I think probably the most important one is you've got to have a strategy. You've got to know how you're going to get from one point to the next point, how you're going to measure yourself along the way. Because as you get closer and closer to that final goal post where you're ready, you will get that kind of feeling inside, like, I'm ready. I can do this now. And for me, that was like, it came up suddenly. It was like, I think it was like a Sunday lunchtime. I did my final simulation exam. I'm ready. And I went and booked it for Monday and did it.
Yeah. No, that's very good advice. And, you know, a good point that you made, Paul, and that's something that I've kind of told people as well, is that if you do these simulation exams, it really tells you kind of almost subconsciously what to expect in the exam. You learn that kind of style of answering of questions. So it is a really valuable thing to do. And even what I've suggested as well to people is that if you maybe take a practice exam even before you feel comfortable that you've covered the BABOK content, to set a baseline for yourself, so you know where you are at in terms of the exam. Plus, like I say, you subconsciously know then how to practice or how to study, because you know what the exam questions might be like. Okay.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point, because when I was doing my simulation exams, the Watermark, I think Watermark got sick and tired of me, because I would email them probably every day and say, I don't really get how you got to this answer. Please explain it to me, or I challenge their thinking. And Esther, you know, I do that. I actually got to realize that there was slight little nuances in the questions, and this will come up in the main exam, where there'll be a slight word that's slipped into that makes the entire meaning of that sentence different. And being human, and specifically when you're under pressure, you don't even see that word, and you read the sentence totally differently. And the interesting thing, when I was doing my stats for my simulation exam, I found so many of the questions were because I misread so many of my incorrect answers were because I misread the question. So yeah, if we go to the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit more about my strategy with Watermark. So this is kind of Watermark here, and I just want to briefly talk about the strategy here. So you'll see in the center section, it's called drill, and that's exactly what it is. And when I started off, I didn't go and learn. I read the whole BA book once too, but when I started doing the practice exams, I'd take one knowledge area at a time. I didn't even look at techniques. I didn't even look at underlying competencies. I only just concentrate on the knowledge area. So, for instance, there, requirements analysis and design definition. I would go study the chapter, go do the exam, do the drill, and then I would continuously do that backwards and forwards with that, but until I got to a certain percentage, which for me was about 80%. Then I would add another knowledge area and another knowledge area until I'd done all those knowledge areas. And the nice thing with that drill thing is that you can actually mix and match different knowledge areas. So you could actually go and say, let's do strategy analysis with solution evaluation, which is a good combination, because one of the questions you probably will get is about when is a strategy analysis and when is a solution evaluation. You all know it's when there's a solution in play. So that was that. Once I was getting kind of comfortable, okay, at 80%, I then moved up to the warm-up exercise, which is the next level. Now, I don't know if this is really how they're structured, but I felt that the further up I went in that list, the harder the questions got. And I started off on 25 questions, and when I was starting to get up to 80%, okay, I moved on to 50 questions. And the reason I was doing that, because I just wanted quick iterations of learning and study.
Yeah.
Again, I still wasn't concentrating on techniques and underlying competencies. It was really about the knowledge area. You will get techniques and underlying competencies in those drills and those warm-up. But here's the thing is, as you answer those questions, you're actually learning those areas.
Yeah.
And you really brought techniques and underlying competencies in towards the end. And the reason I did that is because the BABOK is a humongous big piece of work, and you've got to break it down. And this is why I started first on each knowledge area, and then slowly built up, and at the end, threw in the techniques and the underlying competencies. You can't do everything at once. If we go to the next slide. So this is kind of your overall dashboard, and you'll see that's actually mine. You will see that the percentages you get after each exam within the different knowledge areas. The reason why the last three are 0 is because those questions are all interlinked into the other knowledge areas.
Okay.
Yeah. So my aim was, if you look at the overscore, my aim was to try and get this up to 80 and then 90%. This was taken before I got to the end, so that's why I said 75. After each simulation exam or each warm-up, I would look at the lowest 2 scores for the knowledge areas, and I would go back and restudy those. Again, you can't do everything. If you had to go and do all of those knowledge areas, every simulation, you will have these long gaps in between, and you want to get shorter iterations to get knowledge up. understand that it is a long process, and understand that it's just each day building on your knowledge, building on your knowledge, building on your knowledge. And so this becomes quite useful, this particular table.
Yeah. So you can really see your progress, and you're breaking it down into manageable chunks, and then you're mastering it. And I suppose also from a psychological perspective, you feel like you're making progress and you are building that knowledge. Whereas if you try and do it all in one go, you might not do very well, and it might look across the board as if you're not doing very well. So, and it becomes very overwhelming.
And that's a good point, because like I said before that you can't study everything. Your brain has a limited capacity in attention span and all that. So break it down. Concentrate on one or two knowledge areas until they get up. I just want to point out something. If you look at my overall scores and you look at the bottom six, and look how erratic it was at that particular point. If you look at the last one, 63% overall, then it jumped up to 83%. Then it went down to 72.5, and then down to 69.7, and then went up. Expect that to happen. Okay. So what I found is, in the beginning of my simulations, what would happen is my scores would be quite high, or they'd be medium, and they would stay there, and they'll slowly start to creep up, and then there will be that day that it's dropped. That's going to happen. Keep cool, keep calm, and just keep going. It's going to happen.
Yeah. No, that's a really good advice. So yes, good idea to try and do simulation exams, even if you don't get to do something as sophisticated as this. If you can break it down into smaller chapters, and you find some questions to answer for each of those chapters, that will already help you to build that confidence and build your knowledge up. So I don't think what we are saying is you have to go and get, sophisticated, like watermark learning. That's what they do. It's really useful to get their simulation exams, and clearly it's very, very good. But there are lots of people that's able to study in smaller chapters. So don't feel you have to go spend money on doing that if you don't necessarily have the money to spend. But the message, is break it down, build up slowly, and just keep it manageable for yourself.
Yeah, and watermarks are not the only one. There are plenty others out there that do it as well.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So you ready for the next question, Paul?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay. So this is now bringing us to that question of, what is the most important BABOK areas that you feel you need to study to get through these exams?
So I think, like I spoke earlier about knowledge areas, I think that is where your focus needs to be, on the core knowledge areas. Get that really under pat, that you know those, you know your elements, you know your inputs, your outputs. Someone once said to me when I first started my journey is, don't try and learn it like a parrot. Try and learn it to understand it. And if you do CBAP, and I think also CCBA, that is so important, that you learn to understand, because you're going to have very few questions on list or the task within the business analysis planning management. You're going to have very few that at the CCBA and the CBAP level. It's going to be more kind of application questions. So rather learn to understand. I spoke about techniques, and techniques are important. I must say, in my exam, and just remember and keep this in context, I wrote one exam. So whether it's true for all, I don't know. I only got one question on techniques.
That's probably a coincidence, because I know there are more than one version of the exam. So there's at least 3 or 4. And when I did my exam, and granted my exam was a long time ago, and they have revised the exam since then, I remember some techniques questions where they actually painted a scenario for me, and they gave you multiple techniques listed as one multiple choice answer option.
Yeah.
And you had to reason through which combination of techniques would actually make sense for a specific scenario. And personally, I found those quite challenging. You really had to understand what is the purpose of a technique, why would you apply a technique, and what will you get by applying the technique. You may not need to know exactly how to implement that technique from a technical perspective, but you really have to understand the purpose almost, and the kind of what is it going to give you to be able to answer those questions. So was your techniques question similar, where you got multiple techniques to choose from, or how did they roughly?
I got a lot of those in my practice exam and my simulation exam. And again, one mark's pretty close to what you're going to get in the actual exam. Although I personally think the case studies in the exam were a lot more difficult, but I got a lot of those and a lot of in the simulation exam, but also be careful. And I know that the IIBA do this as well. Be very careful where they change the naming slightly. For instance, I'll give you an example. They might give you a list of techniques, and one of them says functional analysis. There's no such thing as functional; it's functional decomposition.
Yes.
And I can tell you, I got tripped up in the simulation quite often with that. Like, yeah, I should have known that.
Yeah.
Because you are going to fly through that, and you see the word functional, and you say it's that one, and you skip over it. So yeah, I got questions on techniques. I got actually there were two. There was one on a use case diagram, and there was one on a activity diagram. So the two I got.
Yes, and I think actually, if you look at the exam questions that the IIBA provides us with to give you a feel, from memory, I think I saw one that was a use case based question as well. So that's probably a good one for people to make sure that you can do that one. But I was going to say that, so what you're saying actually, and this is perhaps where that little bit of recall study comes in, is that terminology remains important for the IIBA as well as the BABOK content. So yes, you may think that functional analysis and functional decomposition are close enough, but it's not close enough for the purposes of the exam, and it's not close enough obviously for the industry standard. So make sure that you do know the different techniques and what they are very specifically called, because clearly you need to know those details, not to get tripped up on those types of questions. So they're just in those recall theory kind of questions in a roundabout way.
Yeah, and also know when to apply that technique. So when is it used within a task, within elicitation and collaboration? When is it used, and how it's used?
Yes.
Because it can be used differently. Again, I mean, the techniques is there 50 techniques, probably the biggest chapter in the BABOK. Again, I'm just going to reiterate, strip it out in your initial learnings. Don't get too hung up about it. Just get your knowledge areas packed down, and then start to bring that in. It will also help you, because when you really know your knowledge areas well, and you start to go to your techniques, the understanding and the linking between the two becomes a lot clearer.
Yeah, that's a very valuable comment. And I know that something that I've actually found very useful is the way at the end of the BABOK guide in the appendices, where each of the techniques are basically mapped to the different tasks. And if you are able to, I would say with a technique, you can take a technique and say, yes, I can see how this is applied within the different tasks that it's been mapped to. That will mean that you are really understanding what that technique is for. But I agree with you, Paul. Yes, let's leave that for the last stage, because then you would, by then you will understand the tasks really well. And once you understand the tasks very well, it will just gel a lot easier if you then have to interpret the different techniques.
Yeah.
All right. So what
Um,
is the competency model?
so I got, I think, 1 or 2 questions in the exam on this, but a lot of questions that came up in my simulation exam. And the reason why I put it in there, because understanding the competency model,
Yeah.
and how it's applied in each knowledge actually starts to get your brain thinking, and in a way that you can actually look at a question and say, you know what, that answer makes sense because I've understood how the competency model is applied in that knowledge area. Because you need to understand how all this interlinks with each other. You need to understand where elicitation and collaboration fits in with requirements analysis and design and strategy analysis and design. When do you do strategy analysis design? When do you do solution design? And the business analysis competency model helps you kind of get to link it all together. So once I started to actually really get that, and I really only started to get that when I did the simulation exam, to be honest with you, that was actually when it started, the light bulb went on. So, oh, okay, that makes sense.
Yes.
Because in the simulation exam, when you, and I'll get this later, I've got an example of a question from the simulation exam. They not only give you the right answer and why it was right, but they give you the wrong answer and they give you the reason why it's right or wrong.
Okay.
So, which helps your learning as well.
Yeah. And, you know, my experience with this, with the competency model, when I've developed some content for training courses and also for the study guide I recently published, is that competency model, when you just read it as it stands in the knowledge area, without an understanding of the knowledge area, it's quite hard to interpret because it's a very abstract concept in many ways. So it also helps if you can take, once you know the knowledge area and you understand the knowledge area, take each of the values in that competency model or each of those competencies and interpret it and try and find an example of that in the context of that knowledge area. And that helped as well, just for me to see how it all really fits from my perspective. So that whole thing about bringing your own practical experience and ways that you can make sense of it by saying, oh yes, I've applied it like this, or oh, that's an example of where I've applied this concept. That will go a long way to cement in those concepts as well, I think. You have to trust your own experience also. You know, people don't always look for other people's experience. Look at your own. You'll be surprised just how much you've got already.
And I think that's also important, and that's why if you're doing your CCBA or your CBAP, they ask for a certain amount of experience in that. Having said that, just be careful because the BABAC's not always the most practical way that you think it would be applied.
Yes.
You know, so just be careful sometimes. I mean, there were a lot of questions. I thought, that's just not the way it's done. But I know that is the right answer, you know. So just, you need to strike the balance there.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on. I can see that we are, yes, our time is slightly limited. So let's go and see what type of tools. So I think you've covered some of these questions.
Yeah.
What helped you the most, and what did you use?
Okay, so we've spoken about simulation exams. For me, it probably was where my biggest learning came out, because I now was starting to apply knowledge. The BABAC guide, for me, the BABAC guide was probably middle of the road because it's really a difficult thing to read. But I think I got a lot more out of the study groups and the courses I did, which broke it down into kind of understandable English. And that, I know it's funny for a person who speaks English to say that, but it just helped me to kind of really get my head around certain things and understand certain things. And I think the last one, the wrong answers, and that links back to simulation. That is probably the biggest learning that I got is why was my answer wrong?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you slip into the next slide there, I'll go a bit deeper into that one. Okay. So this is a typical example of a question from Watermark's simulation, and you will see in that particular answer. There's a correct answer, and there are the rest that are incorrect. They not only give you the reason why it's incorrect, but they give the reason why it's correct, and a link to the BABOK area that references it. You also notice, and this is coming back a little bit to my strategy, if you just look at the top of the line, you'll see things called flag, unflag, wrong answer, backwards and forwards. Okay. I used those quite extensively when I was doing my simulation exam. For instance, if I answered a question and I felt uncomfortable the way I answered, I flagged it.
Okay. Yeah.
And the reason that, or if I guessed an answer, or I just thought I have no clue, but yeah, let's just go with one. And that's an important thing in the exam. Don't leave a question unanswered because you really don't know. Just choose what looks the best answer for you, because there's no negative marking here, so it doesn't really matter. And when I went back after each simulation exam, I'd go through all my flag questions, and I'd look at where I got it right, where I didn't get it right, look at the reasons. Then I'd run through all the wrong answers. And you'll see on the side, I've got a little icon of Excel. I actually copied those questions into an Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Now, before I continue on that, I also want to put a warning out there. Watermark is copyrighted. So if you're going to do that, that's for your own eyes. It's not for sharing. You don't hand it out to anyone, because at the end of the day, this is about your integrity. The reason why I put it into Excel, in Excel, is I categorize it. So I would categorize according to knowledge area of the question, then task, and then a link to the BABOK guide. I'd have the answer and the question and the possible answers. And what that allowed me in my revision process, I earlier spoke about choosing the lowest knowledge area after each exam and revising that one. This was part of my plan. I went to all the questions and I go look at the areas of the particular knowledge. Okay, that's where I need to gen up. That's where I need to increase my knowledge using that. And so that's quite a good strategy to use, because it starts to focus your learning more on particular areas. Again, just want to make sure, just remember copyright.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so that's good. I'll jump to the next question. So this question, and I think you've touched on this already, but what are the questions like? I mean, in the previous question, you just said something that I know a lot of people wonder about, and we've said it a few times, but there is no such thing as negative marking in this exam. So you don't have to worry about that. But how about, what was the questions like? You mentioned also the case studies were quite hard. What is your thoughts around what could we share with people that might help them get themselves prepared for that?
Okay, so talking about case studies, before I did my exam, a friend of mine who did his CBAP about 4 years ago, said to me, "You're probably going to get the most difficult questions up front." And when I did the exam, he was spot on. I think the first 40 questions were all the case studies, and they were the most difficult questions. So expect that. It seems to be based on that. It seems to be the norm, that you're going to get your case studies up front, and it's approximately about 30 or 40 questions or case studies. Yeah. And it's a case study with probably 4 to 10 questions afterwards based on the case study.
Okay.
And it's each one is a multiple choice question, and it's not a case of more than one answer. It's a case of the answer is correct or is the most correct answer out of all of them. So just be careful that it's not always about the correct, it's the most correct answer as well. On case studies, read it carefully. I had an example of a question where it was about determining the value of a solution. And they had various options in this table. But there was a sentence in the case study that said, along the lines that the steering committee has accepted this particular solution, and I can't go into too much details because I'm not allowed to from the IIBA's point of view. has accepted this particular solution. Now, when you went to the table, you realized that you actually had to adjust the figures in order to answer the question because that particular solution had been accepted. So just be careful. There's a little nuances that they throw in. Did I feel rushed for time? No. To be honest with you, I ended the exam with my first pass with an hour to go.
Okay.
But then again, don't always go on what, because I said so. That's just the way I work with exams. So the way I work with a question is, if I can't figure out the answer in a couple of seconds, I flag it. I also flag it if the question I answered was a guess or I'm not quite sure. You don't want to dwell too much on it. And the reason why I don't want to dwell too much is because it starts to create pressure and stress in you. I remember again, the same friend that gave me advice before I wrote my exam, he said, your very first question, you'll probably go like, what the heck are they asking? And he said, flag it, move on. And it was true. The very first question I looked at and said, I don't know what you're asking me. And I flagged it and I moved on.
Yeah.
And I went to the exam and I did everything. And I came back to the beginning and I looked at the question and said, oh, that makes sense. And I answered it.
You were probably stressed that first little bit. So you just didn't read clearly. So you probably got down after a while. So yeah, that's...
Yeah, and just a word of warning, if you're flagging questions come back, manage your time because you're going to need to leave time at the end to come back to those questions and answer them.
Okay. All right. Now that's good.